you a house. And that's what Solomon was referring to when he talked to God about how God was gracious to David and had put his son upon the throne, and if the sons would be faithful, there would always be a son on that throne. And we eventually will hear of that great son of David, Jesus, coming to take the throne, to dwell on the throne forever, not just the throne of the nation of Israel, but King of kings and Lord of lords. Solomon hears that gracious promise of God, and so he begins to prepare to build the temple. And in chapter 5, the king from Tyre comes, Hiram is his name, sends an envoy to Solomon, and Solomon recognizes that while David had done a lot to prepare for the building of the temple, not everything was in place, and he needed timbers, and he responds with the invitation to purchase the timber, and the king agrees to that. And then in chapter 6, we read about the actual building of the temple. And when I was in Israel, there was a model of what Jerusalem would have looked like in the days of Herod and Jesus. And so hopefully we have some pictures that will come up. And this is a scale model. Yes or no, David? There we go. On the very right, in the middle of the screen, halfway up, is what we call the Temple Mount. And the temple is on the left side of that, the taller structure. We'll take a better look at that in just a minute from the Mount of Olives, which would be on the east. We're looking from the south to the north. And part of the reason I wanted to show this picture is last week we talked about David and Bathsheba, and David being on the roof looking down and seeing Bathsheba, and in this relatively flat land. It's like, how would that happen? You know, it's hard to get that in your mind. So here, if you look at the houses on the hillside, right? One above the next, you can see how it would be very easy on that flat kind of roof for people to use that as kind of a living space and the person above to be able to look down. So just to give you a bit of an image in your mind of how that could be. And then the next picture is more of the Temple Mount standing on the Mount of Olives to the east, looking to the west. And you can see people in the background. It gives you an idea of the scale of the model, but at least it gives you some concept. And again, this is not Solomon's temple, this is Herod's temple, but it's patterned after Solomon's temple. And we have that outer courtyard. I was going to ask for a pointer, and I forgot. You can see just right next to the temple in the center, there's a kind of a line that goes on the left side. There's one on the right. You can't see it quite as well. That line is a dividing line. The court of the Gentiles is to the left of that. They couldn't come near, right? And then inside of that, and David, if you could go to the next picture, there you can see the line a little better, okay? So to the left, to the right of the temples, the court of the Gentiles, the court of women would be on the outside of the building, but between the little wall there. And then we have the stairwell going up, and then the inner court where the men could go, and then into that inner room is the Holy of Holies, where only the priest could go, and that once a year. So, and then we have the stairwell here. We were looking at it from the south. You could see that hill sloping up. There's also stairs there, and sometimes in Scripture it's talking about that stairwell. Peter and John, when they came into the blind man in Acts, for example, they were on that south wall with the steps. Going up into these steps is another place in Scripture. So those are just some pictures to give you an image of what this temple was like. In chapters 8 and 9, we learn of the dedication of the temple. And because of time, I won't get into that. I won't read that so much, but I invite you to do that. In chapters 8 and 9, we read of Solomon dedicating the temple, of the presence and the glory of the Lord coming down upon the temple and filling the temple, and the people recognizing that God is now dwelling in the midst, and Solomon acknowledging that the whole world can't contain God, much less the temple, but acknowledging that God's presence is in his temple with his people. God is in their midst. Solomon enters into a time of prayer. This is the first Sunday of the month, and during this year we've been focusing on prayer on the first Sunday of the month. And so just recognizing this passage and in the life of Solomon, how Solomon went to worship and God spoke to him, how Solomon dedicated the temple and entered into prayer and God spoke to him. The importance of prayer, the importance of the temple, of having God in the midst and people being able to speak to him, knowing that his presence is with them. God wanted to use his people to draw others to himself, and we have some of that happening recorded for us here in 1 Kings. For example, when the Queen of Sheba comes, she had heard of Solomon's wisdom. She came to see for herself, and in seeing, she experienced the presence of God. The presence of God with his people, with an invitation, remember Abram's promise by God to be a blessing to the nations. It's part of what's going on there. And if only the story had ended then, but it doesn't. The story goes on, and we read, unfortunately, that Solomon didn't have a whole heart for God. He had half a heart. In chapter 7, we read about the construction of his palace. The end of chapter 6 tells us that it took 7 years to build the temple. The beginning of chapter 7 tells us it takes 13 years for Solomon to build his palace. This says something to us about Solomon's focus. And then we also notice, as we continue reading in chapter 10, of the accumulation of wealth. Something God had promised to him. Because he asked for wisdom, God said, I'll also give you great wealth. But one of the dangers of wealth is that it can lead our heart astray. Now, we don't read that happening with Solomon in terms of wealth, but we do read of it happening in terms of something else. We learn about the addition of wives. The addition of wives in chapter 11. And not just any wives, but foreign wives. In chapter 3, we learned about the wife from Egypt, but it didn't stop there. He multiplied that. Hundreds of times he multiplied his wives. The thing that God had instructed his people not to do is another thing that Solomon did. And finally God got to a point where he said, that's enough. I tried to move you and redeem you and restore you into right relationship with me, but you ignore me. You ignore my words. In chapter 11, verse 9, we read, the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Solomon failed to give heed to his own wise words. Above all else, guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. Above all else, guard your heart. It belongs to God, the one whose image you bear, the one who is at work redeeming and restoring you, calling you into a right relationship so that you can know life, abundant life, true life, the way God created it to be. Guard your heart so that you can experience a covenant love relationship with the one whose image you bear. Remember the upper story, that God is at work, seeking to redeem and restore his people, his creation. We'll go forth into this week with an invitation to give our heart to many things, to think that the story's about us, that we need to accumulate wealth and make a name for ourselves, instead of being in love with the one who made a name for us already, who desires to put his name on us and be in relationship with us. A covenant love relationship. above all else, guard your heart. Would you join me in prayer? Lord our God, our Father in heaven, we recognize